The Kingdom of the East is a prosperous land with fertile soils where people lived and knew no troubles. But one day, the sky turned poisonous, then burst into thousands of lightning bolts, causing the inhabitants to shudder. Only 10 years are allotted for peaceful existence, and then the kingdom will fall at the hands of the 5 great sins. Poisonous flames and powerful explosions will all fall upon the unfortunate city in an instant, leaving only bare stones. The main character, sitting in his office behind a pile of documents, was thinking painfully. To prevent the demise of an entire kingdom, he became the patron saint of sins. So far, they were ordinary young people. And to be honest, the main character didn't think that everything would turn out like this. In a past life, he was an office slave who worked 78 hours a week and suddenly found himself in the body of a nobleman from another world. The boy didn't understand why. After moving to another world, the new language didn't automatically stick in his head. Here he was illiterate and lacking any special powers. However, there were also some advantages to the limited situation, and some very pleasant ones. Like, for example, an unimaginable amount of delicious dishes at every meal. The pretty maids bowed when their master thanked them enthusiastically for dinners and lunches, and offered to help them take a bath before bed. Having become a young gentleman in a count's family, where one can do nothing and live as one pleases, the protagonist enjoyed all the privileges of such an existence. Sitting in the bathroom in the company of helpful staff, the guy had no idea where he was, but he definitely liked it all. The protagonist, exhausted from the massage and hot water, did not immediately hear the maid's words. She asked him to go to bed early, since the masters were expected to return tomorrow. The girl smiled, saying that the gentleman was asking strange questions, as if he didn't know his own family. The brothers Leo and Tonio. He immediately went cold, realizing that the names seemed very ominous and familiar. Suddenly, the boy grabbed his head and lowered it into the hot water, thereby frightening the servants. With his eyes and mouth wide open, the protagonist silently screamed in despair, as if he had found himself in psychedelia. It was a well-known RPG game, quite difficult to complete, but therefore loved by many. The guy literally lost his mind when he bought a game console and learned about psychedelia. Subsisting solely on energy drinks, he was unable to tear himself away from the exciting action until late at night. And although the game's plot was worked out in detail, it seemed like there was one bug. Whatever path the player chose, the kingdom, the nobility, and the cities all went to hell. The reason for this was the emergence of 5 great sins: anger, greed, laziness, pride, obsession. And among them, the Palatial house played the role of antagonists, where the eldest son Leo is the king of prostitutes, and the second son, Tony, is a drug lord. The main character, who had been transported into the body of the offspring of a noble family of thugs from a side quest that began before the main story, fell to his knees in despair. In this quest, you need to investigate the Palatial house in the kingdom of Asteria, who was involved in prostitution and drug trafficking, and they also ran an organization called Avalon. Only now did it dawn on the guy what the luxurious mansion he found himself in constantly reminded him of. Alan Palacio, a minor villain and the 3rd son of the Palacio family, is the one in whose body the protagonist finds himself, and the family will also be the first to be destroyed by the 5 great sins. Out of desperation, Alan lay down on his bed in a corpse pose and placed his hands on his chest, holding flowers that were given to the dead at funerals. He begged for his 78-hour work week to be returned to him. Hot tears flowed onto the pillow. The guy, despite his luxurious life, knew that he would die in 10 years, and that was worse than sitting for 6 months without a salary. He thought about how lucky others were, but he was transported into the body of a fictional character without a single ability. Suddenly, Alan sat up in bed. The thought that struck him was this: knowing what would happen in 10 years makes him practically a prophet. He tore the flower stem apart, deciding that he simply had to prevent the fall of this world. So the young master of the House of Palacio decided to take on the 5 great sins in the name of a peaceful, noble life. It would be easy as pie while they were still children. 2 months were not wasted for Alan. Sitting in his office, he announced that he and his assistant had rescued orphans from an Eastern orphanage, which was in fact a center for human experimentation. Knight Alana Evan, a stately man with a black patch over one eye, bowed to his master adding that it was done in the name of saving a girl named Yutia. The young master chuckled, saying that he knew how to choose people. Evan was indeed a special person. The knight was embarrassed, looking at the floor. He did not understand whether it was a compliment, because the owner always had such an inscrutable face. But Alan confirmed that he had praised Evan. Deciding to reinforce his request, he smiled tensely, even somewhat creepily, and said that he was counting on the man, who became even more embarrassed, muttering that he certainly wouldn't get used to something like this anytime soon. But not so long ago, the young gentleman openly expressed his emotions. He could be read like an open book. The knight watched impartially as his master rehearsed that very smile in front of the mirror, lamenting that it seemed the rebirth of the soul had affected only the face. Evan, a rare character in psychedelia, remained honest and loyal despite all the betrayals. He scratched the back of his head and sincerely thanked the young master for the praise. But still, he understood that Alan said all this only to save the girl Yutia. Now the knight understood why, because even for him, an experienced mercenary, she was an unusual child. On the orders of the protagonist, the mercenary arrived at the dungeon, and before he could get close to the bars, he was stunned. This girl seemed to glow from within, and was strikingly different from the other captives. She was so strong that Evan couldn't understand why she didn't fight back. The man asked Alan why the master had not brought Yutia to the mansion, since there was no point in keeping her in the dungeon. The guy nodded. From the outside, it might seem like he was simply neglecting her, but leaving the girl there was part of the plan. Yutia Bladia was an inhuman being destined for an unenviable fate. She will form a contract with an otherworldly being for its power and become wrath, one of the 5 great sins, to destroy hundreds of thousands of people. Alan had a plan: to place Yutia in a peaceful environment. Then he would finally be able to disable one of the machines. Now we need to think of something for the night, and the young gentleman began from afar, slowly. He clasped his fingers and closed his eyelids, lazily informing the man that it was not yet time. Evan was taken aback by such indifference, muttering someone else's phrase in confusion. Alan Palacio nodded and ordered the mercenary to make sure no one talked and to provide them with sufficient funding. The knight bowed, and the owner handed him a letter, asking him to give it to Yutia. The protagonist wanted to deliver a letter of support, since Yutia had already been through so much, and Evan promised to deliver the message. And what's more, he'll even make sure the girl reads it, and then take his leave. Alan watched the knight leave through the window, thinking that he was not sure that this letter would calm the captive. But the real purpose of the letter is to insert there the phrases that the Archbishop said, that this prayer will help give a person peace. The Holy Father commanded the wrath of sin to be humbled, to go away to the torments of darkness, the indifference of light, and the belonging of the fall. During the Sin of Wrath storyline, some truly terrifying things happened. The girl, who no longer looked like her former self, whispered to the victims that it was too late. In the game, all attempts to subdue her fail, and a battle begins. But now, perhaps, it is not too late. Finally, Alan moved away from the window and stretched, loosening his numb arms, thinking that since he had dealt with one, maybe he should move on to the next target. Of course, it was stupid to hope to befriend a monster because of some quote, but maybe it will work, since they worship some deity from another world. Looking at the sun, the guy shrugged his shoulders, because it's hard to understand how these guys think. They're just like fanatics. This girl, Yutia Bladia, looked like one of the most respectable parishioners. Evan couldn't look at her calmly, because he felt mana that was simply incredible. Yutia studied the letter she had brought with a strange expression on her face, as if she had no emotions at all. The knight winced when she asked if the letter really came from Master Alan. Suddenly, the captive jumped up and opened her eyes, the color of bloody cherries, asking why the owner hadn't taken her to his place. The mercenary was shocked by the enormous amount of mana that was manifested in this child. After all, mana appeared in such a form only in the kingdom of the Overlord. Unable to take his eyes off the captive's tense face, Evan remembered Alan's words. The man blushed and babbled that the time had not yet come, and the girl whispered that she understood. Yutia lovingly pressed the paper to her heart, whispering that this was a promise that only the master knew about. Seeing the incredible radiance and feeling the murderous energy, the knight involuntarily grabbed the hilt of his blade. Sin of Wrath, daughter of the monsters, Blood Queen. Yutia smiled happily, clutching the letter to herself. Meanwhile, Alan, lounging in bed, was glad because he had managed to prolong his luxurious life a little longer. Even the bright moon is on his side today, which means the main character will also try his best with the next child. The next morning, Alan Palladio went to the library where he suffered a misfortune. A pile of heavy books fell on him. My head was literally splitting from the search for clues to the game's third boss, but a mercenary immediately came running and told me that the second child had been found and saved. Rubbing the bump on his head, the young gentleman asked if Evan had been extremely polite with him since the child had been taken from the slave market. At that moment, the wooden door behind the knight swung open, almost falling off its hinges. Count Palladio's second son, Tonio, almost stepped on his brother and greeted him with ironic enthusiasm. Tall and stately, extremely optimistic, he asked since when such an ignoramus as Alan had taken up books. Not hearing an answer, the elder gentleman's mood changed, and he ordered an answer in a low voice. The protagonist didn't understand how the real Alan tolerated this oaf, but he still fell to his knees, mumbling that since Tonio needed the library, he would leave. The man laughed and kicked the younger gentleman, exclaiming that the puppy really knew his place. At that very moment, something flew past him with a whistle. It was a very sharp blade that pierced the opposite side of the wall. A tall male figure appeared on the threshold, shouting and asking what all the noise was about. Count Leo Palladio's eldest son, handsome and dissolute, ordered Tonio to get lost because he didn't want to quarrel so early in the morning. The older gentlemen already had knives and fists at each other's throats, exchanging curses. While they were trying to prove their superiority, Alan was making his way face down to the exit. Yes, the Pallatio house in the game might not have lasted long, but it was much stronger than the main character expected. Generally speaking, the Vile brothers are fighting for the position of head of the family. Leo is a major figure in the criminal world, the king of prostitutes. They couldn't share toys since childhood, and what can we say about what was happening now? Tonio was the head of a huge drug cartel. They called him simply the drug lord. These two were not worth getting involved with just for their own safety, so the younger Pallatio brother and Evan slowly made their way to the exit. Meanwhile, a real massacre began in the library between two relatives. The knight stroked his master's head soothingly, and he clenched his fist, promising himself that he would live a long and happy life as an inconspicuous weakling. Tired of recent events, the protagonist sank onto the sofa with a groan when the mercenary noticed how unusual the second child turned out to be too. Turning away from the pillow onto which Alan had already fallen, he looked at the man in surprise. Looking at this boy, the knight wondered how he could have learned about the illegal slave market and secret bio-experiments in another region. Evan shook his head, guessing that Alan was barely holding himself together right now. The knight decided to talk to the gentleman, carefully reminding him that he was acting strange because he sent the child to an orphanage. He lazily propped his head up with his hand because the child seemed unusual to the guy. But everything was not so simple because this child was a walking disaster. In the United Kingdom of several nations, the central kingdom is the kingdom of Kalian. The man the mercenary rescued from the slave market turned out to be the second boss of psychedelia, Deus Macalian. After being sold into slavery and brutally abused, Deus became the embodiment of one of the 5 great sins, the sin of sloth. The boy, just like Utia, completely lost his human appearance. He destroyed kingdoms in the most horrific ways imaginable, and it was the brutality of this part of the story that left many players in shock. With just his mana and bare hands, this villain killed all the inhabitants, sprinkling the ruined kingdom with rivers of blood. Despite his nickname, the sin of sloth was considered a very hard-working person, so Alan told Evan to treat Deus with utmost politeness. Taking a sip of tea, the protagonist answered evasively, which is why he sent the child to the orphanage. It was not time yet. The knight asked whether to mention the second child in the letter to Utia. Alan shrugged, replying that this was indeed the case. He had also told a little about his life in the message. He also told the girl to take care of a sick child, whom he sent to her. This unfortunate man looked so lonely and broken, as if he had already lived 1,000 lives. Utia approached the boy carefully, as if he were a wounded animal. She almost screamed when she saw the many small scars from cuts on the boy's arms. Utia asked if the black goat had done this to him, to which the boy's eyes widened in surprise. The interlocutor suddenly smiled happily, congratulating her new acquaintance, because the great moon had chosen him. The solemn power of her mana illuminated the darkness around her, and Utia called upon the boy to feel the abilities with which he had been endowed and to reveal his potential. Utia extended her hand, smiling slightly madly at her new chosen one. After all, if he faithfully follows the order, he will be able to carry out his revenge. While Deus was trying to come to his senses, Utia read Alan's letter again. She decided it was time to send her first reply with a short greeting. The young gentleman was just trying unsuccessfully to find the third boss in the library when Evan burst in, shouting that they were in big trouble. He was extremely frightened, and with dry lips he could barely utter that something had happened to the second young gentleman. The main character, who was literally buried up to his ears in books, froze and asked what happened. As it turned out, that bastard drug lord Tonio Palazzo was already dead, which didn't fit into the game's time frame. A few days later, the entire family and loved ones gathered for the young gentleman's funeral. The head of Palazzo, the father of the deceased, sat on a bench, his legs crossed, with some female companions on either side of him, complaining that it was becoming too boring. A lag rolled his eyes. He knew this family was not okay, but it was just a disaster to bring women to the funeral of his own son. Be that as it may, the boy did not think that Tonio would die from an accidental fall. He did not remember such an episode at all. If you remember the game, it was all Leo's fault. The man was so happy that after so many years, he committed fratricide. Even if this man tried to hide his emotions now, the king of prostitutes was definitely the culprit, or his people. But be that as it may, the main character in this world only needs to deal with the 5 great sins. A year later, when the problem with the heir was resolved and Lur took over the drug business, the county became even calmer. Fortunately, Alan's older brother didn't visit him often, and he could go about his business in peace. In the meantime, he and Utia established correspondence. If they maintain contact with the girl, it will be useful in the future. The boy read a letter from the orphanage. All the children were described as very nice and active. He was also surprised by the growth in the shelter's list of sponsors, which was surprising for such a small place. Evan, who had been studying the documents all this time, reported that the Information Guild had found the street. Alan was jubilant inside, although he didn't show it. This must be that same ancient book about the third boss. He would finally find this guy. The young gentleman sighed with satisfaction, looking out the window. Everything was going like clockwork on this quiet evening. At this time, on the other end of the kingdom, the dying cries of another debtor could be heard. At the drug distribution point, Margot discussed the generosity of her eldest son, Palazzo. The two men, chatting cheerfully, went out into the street and were dumbfounded with horror. Absolutely all members of their point were killed in the most brutal manner. Those who remained alive screamed in fear as their hands moved on their own, plunging their own daggers into their throats. The street was filled with terrible sounds, and blood turned from thin streams into real rivers. The night reliably hid the bloody spectacle from all the main directors. The two figures met. Deus lazily fingered the threads that were reaching out to the people. Utia flew up to him and said that she liked today's puppet show. The boy turned to his new interlocutor, quietly asking if there was any point to this. The girl shrugged, asking if Deus felt sorry for the dead, but he knew that these people were killing others to make drugs. It was unlikely that this had anything to do with his revenge. Utia waved her hand through the air, objecting that it was connected, because this was the foundation they would build for his return. After all, we must not allow this place to remain so wretched. Two figures suddenly soared high into the sky, leaving behind bizarre dances of mana. Above them hung a witness to what had happened. The horned moon, Utia, and Deus will do everything as he wishes. The movement of their bodies caused a huge, bright flash to appear over the kingdom. Their organization, Blue Moon, will become his sword, which will lead the ruler to new achievements. Meanwhile, the moonlight fell on the ground, illuminating a strange depression in the ground that repeated the outlines of the moon itself. 2 years passed, and all this time, Alan corresponded with Utia, who still remained living in the shelter. His knight Evan was so tired, he almost fell off his feet after the mission, searching for his master. Finally, the search was successful. Alan was in the yard, and the mercenary was able to fall down on the soft grass with a calm soul. He gave a thumbs up and said that the 5th one had also been successfully sent to the shelter. Alan immediately blossomed with joy and pressed his hands to his mouth, almost screaming, during which time he saved the remaining 3 sins. The guy squatted down in front of his assistant and offered him a cake on a fork, asking him to eat it. There were problems finding the third one, but using the knowledge from the game, the protagonist was able to force Evan to solve everything. He began to throw cakes to the knight, as if he were a faithful dog, and he gracefully caught the treats. Watching the mercenary, Alan said that he had done a great job and could now rest. As it turned out, the good news for the knight was that this was the end of all matters related to the shelter. Evan lay on his back and looked at his master, asking if he wasn't happy, and the boy shook his head. He pointed to his lips, assuring that he was smiling, but the knight still did not see that very emotion, so he resigned himself. Alan stretched well, catching the gentle rays of the sun on his skin. He lay down on the grass, looking at the sky. The main character did not expect that everything would go so smoothly. The bosses in Psychedelia are young men who are tortured, drugged, and humiliated. They became the 5 sins because of their terrible past, which each would prefer to forget. Even with the knowledge from life before becoming sinful, the chances of saving everyone in time were simply negligible. Alan was so afraid that he would come to save the children when they were already broken. He asked Evan how things were at the shelter, and he handed over the letter, replying that, as usual, everything was fine. Previously, these unfortunate children were like soulless, emotionless dolls. But now, everything has changed. They have blossomed, become prettier, and much more lively. Alan nodded as he opened the letter, deciding that the children would not need a separate teacher after all. The protagonist didn't think that Yutia would cope so well. I wonder if it's because of her perception, or if the girl is so attached to the orphanage because of her past. The young gentleman scratched the back of his head, muttering that Yutia was quite a good girl, and Evan asked if there was anything important in the letter. She wrote that everything was fine, some were starting to behave better, and that Alan didn't need to worry. The young gentleman was glad that the children were doing well and growing well. Apparently, the environment really is the most important thing. The knight began to ask when Alan would meet the children, because he always says that the time will come. The main character hesitated and looked somewhere to the side, thinking that he was not going to meet them at all. Maybe it would have been worth getting closer to them, but in the game they had such personalities that I didn't really want to communicate with them. Perhaps it's because the process of turning them into sins was so brutal that it's not so scary now that the protagonist saved them before these events. Alan turned away from his mercenary completely, evasively saying that he would do it in 5 years. Be that as it may, he needed skills to protect himself in this damned world. Magic required talent, and this body was perfect for it. Looking at the owner, Evan asked him in fascination if he had heard of the Blue Moon. Flashes of lightning described circles, as the knight explained that this was an organization that had become famous for its recent hunt for criminal gangs. Alan praised Luna's aspirations without much enthusiasm, but thought that since he had never heard of such a group, it meant the group would soon disappear. The knight stuck out his tongue and ran his thumb across his neck, practically visualizing the blue moon killing even nobles. After these words, the young gentleman tensed up and ordered from that day on to sleep next to his room. Late in the evening, Yutia gathered her team to hear Blue Moon's weekly report and asked what had happened in the north. The cat girl meowed loudly and, washing herself, exclaimed that she had brought the heads of the slave traders. Sin of pride. Solran laughed joyfully, doing a somersault in the air. She offered the scoundrels to guess the color of her eyes in exchange for their lives, but they failed the task. Sin of greed. Rinna, the calm young maiden, briefly reported that the corpses had been burned. Sin of possession. Raiden, a fair-haired, attractive young man, said that the South was also finished. Radan dealt with illegal human testing facilities. Looking at his brothers with crazy eyes, the guy exclaimed that he also turned the bastards from Avalon into mincemeat. Yutia smiled. She was glad that everything would happen according to his will. The secret organization that worships the great moon, the Blue Moon, exists for its sake. Dea spoke up, saying that they had a problem, and Yutia immediately tensed up. The guy said that the head of Avalon is the eldest son of the Count, and when Sin was dealing with the South, he found one dangerous order. Yutia was stunned when she heard that the Count's eldest son was targeting His Majesty. The mana around the girl flared up, threatening to explode and destroy everything around. The rest of the organization swallowed hard, trying to get as far away from the leader as possible. The girl squeezed the letter tightly in her fist, gritting her teeth. It said that after the Count's death, the time for poisoning would come. 2 years later, Alan's father, Count Palatio, died, leaving behind 2 sons. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but it was clearly an overdose. The protagonist stood over the coffin while Leo was talking to someone. He was informed that the blue moon had struck again. The assistants reported that they had attacked the previous night, and the chief asked if they had killed everyone again. Alan overheard the conversation and concluded that the blue moon was becoming more feared. Therefore, the death of the count, which no one mourned, took place in complete silence. Leo Palacio glanced unkindly at his younger brother, who left the hall with his mercenary. When they returned to their quarters, Evan asked what the young gentleman intended to do, and only after a few minutes noticed that the boy was packing his things. Alan handed the suitcase to the knight, announcing that they were escaping, which greatly surprised his assistant. The protagonist looked out from behind the door of his room, clarifying that they were going down. Evan picked up the suitcases and asked if Alan was referring to that same rod mill. That's right. The guy decided to go to Rod Mill, a small town south of Palacio. The carriage leaving the house was being watched from the estate window the entire time. Leo was hiding in the shadows and clearly didn't like what he saw. The man was gripping the balcony railing tightly with his fingers. Meanwhile, things were going well for Alan and Evan. The young gentleman even learned to cook breakfast himself. They had time to take a break from the crazy Palacio crime family. But still, 3 days later the main character returned. And for good reason. He ended up at his brother's funeral. I couldn't even believe that he was here again. And for some reason, Leo died too quickly. Not according to the plot. Looking at the man's peaceful expression after death, it was hard to believe that he had died from a blow to the heart. Wondering who could have killed Leo, Alan turned to the family's guards, and they screamed in fear, as if they had seen a ghost. One of them turned purple and immediately began to apologize for looking at the young gentleman. He raised an eyebrow, staring at the servants, completely confused about what had happened to them. Evan rushed to the aid of the young gentleman. He wanted to tell Alan something. As always, the protagonist asked emotionlessly if his mercenary had found out anything. He covered his mouth with his hand and whispered to the boy if he had made Avalon disappear overnight. Alan was incredibly surprised and turned around to look at the staff. All the maids and security guards began to scatter like cockroaches. Some events happened on that sunny evening when Alan left for Rodmill. Evan asked the young gentleman if it wouldn't be better for them to go to the city. The protagonist's face twisted, and inside he screamed that never, because Rodmill was the end point of his plan. The 5 great sins must be saved from their terrible fate, and the world must not be destroyed. These children should live their lives completely differently, and not even think about evil deeds. Rodmill has nothing to do with the original plot, and Palatios mansion was there too. Still, it was the perfect place for a nobleman to live, and you didn't even have to do anything. As soon as Alan began to say that there is a reason for everything, the knight hissed, "The master will not deceive him. He always says so." Evan rolled his eyes as the boy turned away, muttering that he had already made up his mind. Unbeknownst to them, they were under the close surveillance of a member of the Palatio family. The man pierced the retreating figures with his gaze, thinking about killing Alan, because it didn't matter whether he was alive or dead. After the death of his father, Leo was still going to poison the younger one. He said that he was going to go abroad, so now there was no reason not to kill him. Leo tapped his fingers on the railing, wondering if this was because things were going badly with Avalon. Deciding that his brother was bothering him, the man called his assistant, Alman, and ordered him to follow the carriage. He came out of the shadows and asked in surprise if the owner wanted his brother to die. Now it was the young gentleman's turn to be surprised. He even turned around to check if the person standing behind him was the same. Alman never contradicted him, no matter what Leo ordered, in any situation. And why did this man suddenly start asking questions now? It was really disturbing. The man shook his head in irritation, closing his eyes, and snapped that Alman's job was to do what he was told. This reaction played a cruel joke on Leo, because the next second, the tip of the loyal killer's blade pierced him right in the chest. The man grabbed the sharp edges of the weapon, wheezing how Alman had dared to betray him. He shrugged, thrusting the blade deeper, saying that he enjoyed playing out the confrontation. In fact, the man's name was Haydn, and he worked for Blue Moon. But right now, he was just having fun. The Great Moon taught its children the most important principles. This is the brainchild of that man, and Haydn must act according to his will. Very slowly, the assassin pulled the sword towards himself, telling what would happen if someone tried to harm Luna. Haydn swung his weapon, cutting Leo's neck, saying that he would do as he saw fit. The killer kept waiting for the gentleman to reveal his cards. It took him 2 years to make up his mind. Leo croaked that his subordinates would not forgive the scoundrel, and Haydn only chuckled, replying that Avalon would disappear from this continent forever. He shook his head sadly, looking at his feet, muttering that this was truly a loss for Leo. The man took a running start and jumped from the balcony, shouting at the end that the great moon was giving the young master a chance. Alan woke up on a sunny morning with the clear conviction that Rommel was paradise. He looked around, sleepily thinking that another peaceful day awaited him. The young master can wake up whenever he wants and eat whatever he wants. In short, live the life of a true nobleman. Thoughts drifted lazily through Alan's head. He even considered starting to sell toast. Pleasant thoughts were interrupted by Evan's scream. He flew into the room, holding a letter in his hand. The most delicious bread fell out of the boy's mouth when he read what was written. In connection with the death of Leo Palati, we ask Alan Palati to return. And that's how the heavenly life ended after 4 days. Thus, the young master and his knight had no choice but to return to the estate. And even more so, the main character did not understand what was wrong with the faces of all the staff in the house. Even Evan didn't know. He whispered to the young gentleman, "Since when did everyone start to fear him?" Now Alan will have to deal with a new series of events, and the protagonist is seriously depressed by this prospect. He asked the mercenary with tears in his eyes why he suddenly became a villain. Evan scratched his head, but still said that Alan was the only one who was winning in this situation. After the lord left the estate, Leo was killed, and he has the perfect alibi to become the Count's heir. Avalon is gone, so with Leo dead, Alan will no longer have any worries. This means only one thing. The young gentleman is the Grey Cardinal who organized Leo's murder. What he heard only made Alan feel worse, and he began to wonder with a sad expression where to begin. Since no organization is capable of eliminating a key figure in the criminal world overnight, he asked the mercenary the name of the organization that hunts other groups. Blue Moon. But the Information Guild reported that Blue Moon was not involved in the murders, and all because she leaves her signature mark on the corpse. They say that the members of Avalon were killed with a sword, so the road there is open. Alan understood why he is considered the Grey Cardinal. It turns out that Blue Moon is not involved. Weaklings, who will disappear before the main plot even begins, can't be behind this. Meanwhile, Yutia carefully questioned the members of the organization, asking if they had left any traces. Rinna, clutching her book in her hands, shook her head. There was nothing left. Solran's clear voice was heard, and she exclaimed that she had also been careful. The girl rubbed the end of her blade with her finger and laughed, adding that there were only corpses. Deus returned, his purple manner shining brightly, and the boy himself brought information that 400,086 Avalon soldiers remained. Behind him, he heard a chuckle and the confident voice of the handsome Raiden. He did everything as the boss ordered. The guy smiled radiantly. Throwing a massive weapon onto his back, he cut down all the warriors. Yutia propped her cheek on her palm and shook her head. She was so proud of her people. And just like that, Avalon, the massive organization that dominated the kingdom of Asteria, was reduced to dust in just 5 days. But Raiden did not support Yutia's joyful mood, adding that he doubted the operation would be completed perfectly. He showed a thick envelope with documents that he found at the nobles. They were associated with Avalon, which means the Duchy of Altia has a close connection with them. After a short silence, the girl frowned. She didn't need to say what was already clear. Thin threads of mana stretched into the air from absolutely every member of the Blue Moon. Obsession nodded and grinned. He was going to deal with this quietly. Yutia immediately calmed down and breathed a sigh of relief. This problem would soon be resolved. She asked Rinna if the information had leaked to the Information Guild. The girl shook her head, because this issue is decided separately by the Blue Moon. Deus waved his hand, and several papers flew through the air. He said that all guilds are the same. They call the killer Hell Swordsman. Rinna will monitor his movements to ensure that the question does not reach his ears. When Deus noted with surprise that the man's family had attacked first, Yutia interrupted him, reminding him that it had not been an order. The Swordsman, that's what the Blue Moon organization was, a kind of Avengers, and they should not act of their own free will, but only according to his instructions. Yutia pointed at Luna with a wild look, reminding them that they were working under orders, because that man knew everything. The members of the organization must never, under any circumstances, disappoint him. And to be honest, Deus had not understood Yutia and her actions for a long time, but he could not say so directly. After all, having such outstanding abilities, she experiences anxiety only because of the fear of being discovered. However, there was no point in arguing with the head of the organization, so Deus replied that he understood. Everything was for the great moon. Meanwhile, Alan's affairs were going from bad to worse. He was literally howling in despair. His head dropped onto a pile of papers lying on the table. After the funeral, endless chores dragged on for a whole month. The main character just wanted to laze around and eat, because that's what nobles were for. Yes, he made enemies, but Leo was also supposed to die only 6 years later. Because the order of deaths changed the course of the game, all the work fell on Alan as the heir. His advisors came to him again, and Alan shook his head. Everyone started working like crazy when the Count was alive. They were constantly shirking their work. The advisors, looking at the gentleman's angry face, took his emotions personally and believed that the guy wanted to deal with them too, so they had to work harder. Alan, a former slave who just wants to do his job in peace, couldn't believe that the servants were working so hard because of rumors that he was a murderer. Late in the evening, when Alan and Evan gathered around the fireplace to roast meat, the knight looked at his master, saying that this was amazing. Alan had a tremendous talent for mana manipulation, considering he reached level 2 in just 2 years of self-study. After all, it usually takes about 4 years to reach this level, and magic often requires innate talent. Alan muttered that he did have talent, but in reality, he trained hard for self-defense because he felt unsafe. The protagonist worked even harder to learn how to control his mana, and he was able to direct spheres in a limited space. But one thought, like a small worm, stuck in my brain. What good will it do if I do everything half-heartedly? After all, Alan had already tried all kinds of magic in this world, and at first it was even exciting. If the plan works, he will be able to get rid of all the threats, and then gradually learn more. But now, in a desperate attempt to save his skin, the protagonist realized that his mana reserves were simply insignificant. After this thought, all the spheres went out at once, falling onto the floor in small, magical drops. The innate mana reserve is comparable to the weight category of athletes, and Alan's mana reserve is already very tiny. And, unfortunately, this cannot be corrected or replenished by any training. Just when he thought there was one way, the mercenary waved an invitation to the ball in front of his face. The protagonist shook his head in surprise, asking if that was really what he heard. Just a few days later, Alan, in a specially chosen outfit, went to a luxurious reception with Evan. But not even a few hours had passed before the protagonist's social battery died. He was dead tired. This is a typical aristocratic ball in the southern kingdom of Astalia, a meeting for the nobility. Alan will soon be an earl, so perhaps it's worth taking the chance and making some connections. Yes, connections with the nobility are important for a peaceful future, but something clearly went wrong. As soon as Alan appeared in the center of the hall, all the nobility openly ran away in all directions, screaming in fear. Evan approached the puzzled gentleman, who stood silently, embarrassed, watching the fugitives. The knight could barely contain his laughter as he asked his master not to be too upset. Shaking his head, the protagonist thought that this was expected. He also firmly informed Evan that they would see each other later. It's no wonder that all these people would look down on Alan because of his status. Unlike the days of his esteemed great-grandfather, the current Palatio family is full of troublemakers from the east. But Alan has not come here without reason. He will use the charm skill he has secretly honed. He took a glass of wine and approached a girl standing nearby with the aim of starting a casual conversation. Although the main character thought he looked very attractive, in reality, he looked like a maniac talking about his latest victim. His soft smile, an important social experiment, was more reminiscent of the grin of a wild animal. A look of genuine fear appeared on the girl's face. She almost dropped the glass from her hands. Hearing that Alan would like to take home a few bottles of wine, she rushed to her father to get everything ready. The guests began to whisper behind the gentleman's back, who had not expected such a reaction, saying that Alan was even worse than his late brothers. Evan couldn't help but laugh as his master blinked it all on the girl's shyness. The mountain of gifts grew again. The mercenary whistled. A luxurious horse from Paladoian, citrus tea from Penia, metalwork from Villand, and signature Malentino wine. The Palacio family turned out to be much more notorious than Alan thought, and because of the rumor that he got rid of the monstrous brothers, the guy became someone who was avoided by everyone. His social life was destroyed. Having completely lost his fighting spirit, the main character lowered his head and waved his hand to the mercenary, saying that he would go get some air. All this time, a luxurious woman in red was watching Alan. She slowly drank wine, then broke into a sly smile. The protagonist stepped out into the cool air and leaned on the balcony railing, sighing heavily. The gloomy purple sky echoed Alan. He bitterly wondered why everything had turned out this way. Suddenly, someone's voice pulled the guy out of his thoughts. He turned around sharply, surprised that there was still someone there. A girl's voice timidly asked for forgiveness, asking to take a break for a minute. Alan, who no longer hoped for anyone's company, moved away from the balcony. Looking at him was the beautiful young third daughter of the Duke of Altia, Loria, and this really explained a lot to the young gentleman. He greeted her in return. The Althea family is one of the three main shadow figures of psychedelia, known as the Northern Troublemakers. Alan shook his head, closing his eyes for a second. Loria is definitely not an ordinary girl. But what was strangest was that he didn't remember her from the game at all. However, it is possible that she did not appear in the game at all, and at that time, Loria declared that she would speak frankly. Looking up at the young master, she blurted out that she wanted to borrow his strength. Loria blushed deeply and looked down. She even shook her head so that her bangs fell over her face. The fact is that the girl knew for certain that she would soon be killed. She raised her head and did not take her pleading gaze away from the young master. The protagonist looked meaningfully at the sky, remembering everything he knew about the girl. Tears welled up in the corners of the unfortunate woman's eyes, and she began to tell her that she was born from her father's mistress. Until now, Loria had been protected as the daughter of a close friend of the Duke of Altia, but his condition had deteriorated sharply, and the girl felt that her older brothers would kill her. Alan pursed his lips. After all, the family had decided to drown each other. It was no wonder he didn't remember Loria. She was probably already dead by that time. The heiress of the Altia family pressed her hands to her chest, looking at the boy pleadingly, but he sharply cut off that he had to refuse, while Loria retorted that she didn't just ask for help. If Alan saved her, she would give him half of the Altia family's fortune. But the protagonist was adamant. He turned on his heels and walked away. Even if the master could help, he is not that powerful and can barely take care of himself. It is better not to give the unfortunate woman false hopes. Alan looked back at the balcony one last time. Loria was standing there with her hands on the hem of her dress, her shoulders shaking with tears. The girl did not know what to do and, apparently, tried to come to terms with her fate. Approaching the door, Alan exhaled heavily and arched his neck, rubbing it. After all, he was not a machine, and the choice was not easy for him. Finally, the guy turned to Loria, wishing her luck in this difficult task and hoping that she would find an ally. With a heavy heart, the young gentleman returned to the hall, where he was already being followed by the blue moon. Dea suggested that the Altia family had become close to the great moon, and that he should convey good wishes to both them and the moon. Rinna shook her head. According to intelligence, Loria was the only Altia who wasn't connected to Avalon. Therefore, this girl is the only one who is not Rodan's target. Deus pursed his lips, replying that it made things easier. The rest of the Altia clan would be dealt with. They would act on Luna's orders. The organization's members will focus on intercepting information to prevent Avalon's case from going where it shouldn't. Alan continued to remain at the ball, unaware of his pursuers. He was completely depressed and even began to suspect that there was a barrier around his figure that was scaring people away. But someone suddenly greeted him, and the guy immediately perked up, hoping to communicate with the aristocrats this time. Turning his head, the protagonist saw a beautiful woman in a red dress, hiding her face behind a fan, and assumed that this was another shadow player. Looking at the stranger's smile, Alan thought that no one would have approached him first if he hadn't had some problems. The guy approached the woman and greeted Lady Zenonia, who was surprised that the gentleman knew her. Alan bowed and replied that Zenonia was famous in many ways. In the kingdom of Asteria, there are 3 great shadow players, each with its own name, color, and symbol. Green Rose, Althea from the north, the Violet Eye, inside which the moon looks at the sun, Palacio from the east, and Bloody Zenonia the snake, troublemakers from the west. The one who was talking to Alan was the eldest daughter of Count Zenonius Callius. She abruptly folded her fan and asked if she was really so famous. If the Palatios are run by a gang, then Zenonia is more like a cunningly run crime syndicate. Alan understood that he needed useful connections to lead the quiet life of a nobleman. For his own peace of mind, he couldn't get involved with that woman, and the guy simply paid Callia a compliment. The woman looked slyly at the young gentleman, narrowed her eyes, and offered to talk. Alan, who wanted to leave quietly, tried to refuse under any pretext, citing numerous witnesses around. In response to this, the interlocutor tilted her head to the shoulder and narrowed her eyes, saying that the guy was the same as the rumors said. Turning away, she prepared to leave, adding, in parting, that she would be glad to see Alan again. He looked after Callia for a long time. She really stood out from the rest, but still, the main character did not understand what the woman's words meant. Rinna peered into the guests' faces. The information on the Avalon case was well hidden, but Deus had discovered a new problem. As it turned out, they weren't the only ones keeping an eye on Alan. Someone was following him, and clearly not with good intentions. Blue Moon had no new orders. They continued to observe, and then had to eliminate any undesirables. The next day, Alan and Evan came to a large canyon covered with moss, and the knight kept asking for a long time if they had come to the right place. The mercenary muttered that it was midday, and it was terribly dark inside. But the protagonist had finally reached his real goal. Inside there were many stones with glowing symbols on them. Alan so hoped that it would not be empty. Frankly speaking, the young master came so far south under the pretext of a ball only because of the local whisper labyrinth. If you solve the riddles in all 8 rooms, you can receive a powerful artifact as a reward. While playing Psychedelia, Alan memorized all the routes and puzzles. Looking at the large wall with strange signs in front of him, the protagonist realized that it was time to use his skills. He never thought he could see the labyrinth in real life. The sensations were completely different, even though the guy had gone through this dungeon countless times in the game. Everything seems artificial, as if someone deliberately built this place. Evan asked the owner how he knew this place. He replied that he had often been here. Realizing he had let it slip, Alan chuckled, saying he was joking. In fact, he had his own loopholes. At that moment, terrible screams were heard, and winged monsters rushed down from the dark ceiling. But as soon as they managed to reach the people, steel palms appeared from the walls and crushed them, leaving only a wet spot. Then the palm opened and slowly rose upward, leaving only streaks of blood from the dead creatures. Evan's skin went cold with fear, because if he got the riddle wrong, these things would collapse. But Alan muttered something in response, calmly looking down. Loud shouts were heard from above again. The knight swallowed hard, looking askance at the young master with distrust. He couldn't believe that this guy could act so calmly in such a situation. Evan had been working with Alan for 4 years, but he still couldn't understand his actions. Destroying criminal gangs, saving orphans, sending meaningless letters. The young gentleman hardly left the estate, but it seemed he knew everything about this place. Alan confirmed that the passage would open when the mechanism was assembled. But the reason Evan follows Alan is simple. Everything he does eventually leads to a good result. The main character rejoiced inside himself. The door finally opened. He almost broke his neck trying to figure it out. It seemed that everything was finally over, and the owner and his assistant found themselves in a hall that had opened up to them, filled to the brim with gold. But Alan's goal was not the mountains of coins, but the black ring that was now on the mannequin. The knight was surprised that Alan was going to take one useless ring, but he was told that he shouldn't take anything else. There would be problems. The protagonist put the decoration on the thumb of his left hand and finally received the Oath of Restraint. Knowing the route from the game made everything go smoothly, and Alan promised Evan that there would be nothing dangerous on the way back. But the knight immediately called out to his master. The man lowered his voice to a whisper, asking Alan if he knew that the boulders inside the canyon were golems. Evan immediately pulled his sword out of its sheath, because a new, unknown enemy was the worst-case scenario. He needed to at least get the young master to safety. But Alan amazed the mercenary by calmly replying that he could handle it himself this time. Several huge animated golems with spears at the ready ran at the guy. Evan shouted that he needed to find an escape route first. The knight tried to do something, but realized with horror that second-level magic was not enough. Well, the main character seemed to be afraid of nothing. With the help of the ring, he invoked the Oath of Restraint. A bright light extended far beyond the ring, blinding the golems around it. The boy summoned the fragment that inherited Nyakula's great will to name 2 restrictions that could be imposed. Alan remembered that in the game, this part appeared as a window with a choice above the player. A woman's face appeared above the ceiling, hidden by scraps of fabric. This was the oath, an artifact of the absorption type, which, as the name suggests, allows one to impose limitations on oneself in exchange for power. The voice that came from the stone lips made the world seem very real to Alan. He called on the young gentleman to speak, and he wasted no time in folding his hands into a special gesture. First, when using magic, the main character will always show the cruelty of Babylon. The voice asked what the man wanted to gain with this restriction. When Alan said he wanted the power to bend the laws of the world, the voice granted it to him. The guy clearly remembered that he could ask for something else, and his voice allowed him to speak. The young master wished to pronounce Babylon's lines when using magic. Then the voice asked the same question as before. What does the person want to receive with the restriction? Alan replied that he desired great power, to become omnipotent against the foundations of the world. The woman's face at this moment appeared more clearly than before and fell silent. Alan froze, assuming he had made a mistake somewhere, since he had even copied the exact skill icon just in case. Thanks to multiple playthroughs, the guy remembered all the combinations from the original, which means everything should work. After a short pause, a commanding voice was heard, declaring that the wish had been granted. He also expressed gratitude to the man, the heir of the will, the one who remembered the desires and secrets of the forgotten god. Alan was surprised by the name he was called, then saw that the ring had disappeared, meaning the restriction had worked. The voice said that it would watch over the heir of the will forever. As it turned out, that moment stopped time, and Evan continued to warn the master about magic. He held out his hand to warn Alan as he moved straight towards the golems. The protagonist's face, as usual, did not express any obvious emotion. A current ran through his hands. The ball of light should have killed everyone, but now it just looks pathetic, even though Alan used all his mana. Unfortunately, no matter how much the main character trained, this was his limit. It was time to test the limitations the guy had placed on himself. Standing directly in front of the golems, he clasped his hands together and a small sphere began to form between his palms. She grew larger, casting flashes of electricity to the sides, and Alan raised his hand higher. The protagonist brought his palm closer to his face, surprised that he could still feel the ring on his finger, but it had been absorbed. The first effect was refraction, and the sphere immediately spread out into a large spot in the air. Next came the rejection. A yellow ball, like the sun, appeared above the ceiling. A flock of lightning ran along the entire perimeter of the cave, striking straight at its target. Alan directed this orchestra, trying to make the sphere sometimes crawl apart, sometimes come together. Finally, the sphere turned a poisonous blue color and gained enough strength to fly towards the golems, the line of refraction. And this time Alan, as promised, used the symbols of Avalon. His palm curved in a strange way, his fingers bunched together. Then the guy changed the position of his hand, putting his thumb and index finger together. At the last moment, everything around was illuminated by a bright light, and lightning began to flow straight from the palm of the young master. They crawled to the cave at the speed of light, like snakes. Evan was in great shock when he realized how strong his master was. The golems, driven by mana, could no longer stand steadily on their feet. They staggered and twitched, like dolls abandoned by their owner. After some time, Alan and Evan discovered that the huge stone figures had bowed and fallen silent. Within seconds, the monsters' spears flew to the sides, and their limbs began to crumble. So powerful was the power of the forgotten god granted to Alan. While the living stones were disintegrating, the lightning continued to shine with reflections in space for a long time. Alan and Evan watched in complete silence as the sand slowly settled in the cave. As the young master looked at the fruits of his labor, the knight could hardly find the words to describe what was happening. Finally, he asked the young master if he had been hiding his strength. Alan shook his head. Both stepped back from the edge, Evan noticing that in 15 years of working as a mercenary, this was the first time he had seen such a thing. He asked again if Alan was sure that it was only second circle magic, and the gentleman nodded. In fact, the main character was horrified, but he didn't show it. After all, there was nothing like that in the game. In the psychedelia system, magic could be enhanced each turn through gestures or spells, This time, the protagonist enhanced the magic of chain lightning with 4 spells and gestures. Moreover, Alan did it in just 5 moves. To put it simply, the guy used standard enhancements to create a powerful lightning spell. But due to the player's limitation, he must cast spells when using any lightning. And although the voice thanked the man who remembered the gestures and secrets of the forgotten god, because of this amplification, it must have happened more than once. Evan was glad that they got out of the canyon, but Alan was surprised that the magic of the second circle was more than enough. The result exceeded all his expectations. Evan sat down on a rock and dropped his hands in exhaustion. This was all more tiring than the battle itself. The knight pointed at the canyon and spat, asking the owner who had created such a lousy place. But at this time, Alan was thinking about the Labyrinth of Whispers. A map of the area and a guide to its passage were on the forum, and over time, this place began to be called Pollone's Labyrinth. The mercenary was already losing consciousness from fatigue, but his master led his servant to the east. He needed to check something. Evan rolled his eyes, lamenting that the young master was much more diligent than he appeared. If you select a gesture to match the spell's properties, the power will increase, and if you select the right spell, the properties of the gesture will be enhanced, which is how the rules of the game were supposed to work. Unlike the game, where the visuals didn't change, but only the indicators increased, this time Alan clearly saw how the spell changed shape with each new boost. This spectacle truly captivated the protagonist, and was better than what he had encountered during the game. Perhaps the protagonist sees these changes, because he has special control over them. I'll definitely have to check this out when my mana is restored. It's good that everything worked out. In the night silence of the dark pines, Renee hid, watching the travelers. She was there from the very beginning, acting on the orders of the Blue Moon organization. Finally, the night shift ended, and the girl's figure quickly disappeared. She stopped in front of a large rock carved with the symbols of the Age of Forgotten Gods, the glyphs of the Alanef Empire. The girl removed her hood to get a better look at everything. The inscription was dedicated to a friend who would surpass the coward Palone. Rinna chuckled, running her finger over the glowing blue stone. The one who stopped the invasion of the 4 beasts and defeated Al-Akulak, who devoured the hearts of the city's inhabitants, was the great Emperor Palon the Great. Rinna had all the knowledge because she was born with the ancient library after receiving a great mission. So it was created by someone named Palone. The girl knew that he was special, since the Blood Queen herself was following the guy. But this person could only be judged by legends. Yet Rinna did not expect that the Great Moon would be connected to Palone. What this boy went through is not found in any book in the ancient library. But most importantly, who was this desperate man? Rinna, lost in her thoughts, walked out of the canyon into the silence of the night. She threw up her arms, spinning in a strange dance, thinking that Red Moon was right. I'm ashamed. Very ashamed, for blindly following orders. The leaves rustled nearby, and the girl frowned, seeing Deus approaching, standing on a strong branch of a wide tree. Rinna asked if he had obtained the information. The guy shook his head and said that the Dark One had died. It was a truly horrific sight. The man's head was simply torn off. Rinna nodded, saying that she would have to report it to the higher-ups and let them sort it out. There was nothing more to do here, and both figures disappeared into the distance. Meanwhile, Countess Kalia Zanonia could not sleep in her estate. She sipped the wine from the cup, whispering that it was not just a rumor. The icy indifference of the young Master Palacio was astonishing, and in the eyes of this man, only the abyss itself was visible, no matter what words were spoken to him. The woman leaned back wearily on the sofa, thinking that Count Zanonia was strong. But he thinks that Kalia is powerful in circles, although she doesn't even appear in public. Kalia walked slowly, like a cat, up to her father, who was sitting at the table, asking if it was amazing. The Count, without removing his hand from the sheet of paper, silently glanced sideways at his daughter. Kalia smiled and snapped her fingers, black manna wafting from her hand. The man's empty eyes flashed across the room and reflected his daughter's figure. The Count, like a rag toy, fell headfirst onto the table. Kalia chuckled, because no one had any idea that she had forced her father to play by her rules in order to become the head of the house. And that young gentleman had realized it. And even that throwaway phrase of his about extra eyes apparently noticed the surveillance that she had set up. At that moment, a worried servant ran up to Kalia. Something had clearly happened in the estate. The woman asked angrily what was going on, and the guy urgently called her to go to his room. There, a terrible picture awaited Kalia. Her father, dead, torn to pieces by someone, lay leaning against the wall in a pool of his own blood. The boy noticed that the Count did not know the secret, judging by the fact that the seal was not touched. The woman laughed, thinking that the attackers had set it all up, but where did he get the information from? This man noticed her main weakness at the very first meeting. However, she thought so much about Alan that the guy's ears were burning, and his mercenary passed out from fatigue. Meanwhile, late at night, a carriage arrived at the ducal estate of Altia. Loria smiled bitterly, clutching the hem of her dress. As expected, Alan was not to be underestimated. He is one of the most prominent men in the criminal world, and his eyes are so cold they reminded the girl of her father's eyes. This man was one of those with whom one could not be hostile, and was her last hope. Loria blushed, and a few tears rolled down her cheeks at the thought that the guy would not go for a deal that promised more losses. All of the unfortunate woman's assets and power were taken away by her cunning brothers and sisters, the older brothers, Timmy Allen and Kig, as well as the older sisters, Mariana and Perina. The younger Altia had absolutely nothing left. The girl slowly walked towards the gates of the estate, knowing that she had lived on her father's mercy, but now she didn't know what to do next. Mrs. Loria was greeted by the hysterical screams of the maids running towards her. The girls from the doorway declared that Mrs. Perina and Mr. Kig had committed suicide. Loria froze and opened her eyes wide, shocked by what she heard. After all, these people most likely killed their own family. This is just some kind of nonsense. Swallowing angry tears, Loria asked in a hoarse voice what was wrong with Timalialon and Mariana. At that moment, groans were heard, and the maids burst into the elder brother's office, screaming. An incredible, terrifying scene appeared before their eyes. Both heirs of Altia stood leaning on each other, with sharp blades sticking out of their backs. Loria felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the voices around her turning into white noise. Meanwhile, a figure quickly ran across the glass roof of the mansion. Redan grinned, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. The targets had been successfully eliminated. A second passed, and his silhouette dissolved into the darkness of the night. Loria ran out into the corridor, unable to bear the terrible scene. The servants were already running to inform the others about what had happened. The girl stopped abruptly, inopportunely remembering the words that the young gentleman had said to her at the end. He looked straight at the unfortunate woman, declaring that something good would happen soon. The true ruler of the Count's house is the one who hid his claws in anticipation of the chance to seize power. Loria grabbed her wrist for some support. Now it became clear to her what Alan was talking about. In one night, she became the sole heir to the duchy. What kind of monstrous devil did she have to make a deal with? There is no way back, and what happens to those who betray him is unclear, but there are already many examples. Clenching her hand into a fist, Loria firmly decided that she would follow her chosen path to the end. 2 months later, a servant of the Duke of Altia arrived at the Palatio estate, the man holding a box in his hands and bowing low. Alan opened the gift, and Evan, standing next to him, could not contain his surprise. The young gentleman was given a bottle of Kernan's wine, one of which costs several thousand gold pieces. It would be a real miracle to ever see it in person. The protagonist read the note. It was from Loria, the youngest daughter, and not from the Duke himself, but still a strange gift, since he hadn't helped her in any way. Alan asked if it was really meant for him, and the servant confirmed that the Duchess had personally prepared the letter, and only after hearing the girl's title did Alan become incredibly surprised. This meant that the youngest daughter, Loria, became a Duchess. Sitting in her office, the girl stretched, warming up her arms after a long day of work. For her, 2 months had passed incredibly quickly. After the funeral of her father, who died of illness, she went through the succession ceremony and became a Duchess, although before, she could not even set foot in this office. The death of Loria's siblings was terribly sudden, but suspicion did not fall on the girl. The unfortunate woman had an alibi. She was attending a ball, and at that time, a secret organization got rid of her brothers and sisters. Returning to the mansion, Loria found herself completely powerless. The girl realized this later and was amazed. Just think, this man even turned this situation to his advantage. It was so creepy that the young gentleman outwardly refused Loria without hesitation. But behind the scenes, he pulled off this incredible trick without even being noticed. The girl did not tell him about her father's funeral, not wanting to worry him. All Loria could think about was that the master had helped her because Althea was needed for some plan. And although the girl managed to unite all of Altia's subordinate organizations, this still wasn't enough to compare with the power he harbored. This means he needs something from Loria, and Palatio is a major figure in the criminal world who rose to power solely through his business. And if the mistress of the house, Altia, has something that he doesn't, it's the ability to pull strings in the political arena. The girl vividly imagined how this cruel man controlled people as if they were pawns, and he definitely needs Altia to achieve his goals. However, now, Loria needed to focus on her tasks, because the outstanding one would soon get in touch himself. The girl sincerely hoped that he liked her thank you gift. The servant of the house of Altia bowed in farewell and asked permission to leave. Alan was still processing what had happened. Loria was facing death, and now she was a duchess. Something was wrong. A few more months passed. The time was approaching before the beginning of the original story. There were still 5 years left. Alan was called out to by Evan, asking whether he should call his master a count, since the inheritance ceremony had not yet taken place. The guy thought that it was possible, since a year had passed. He didn't even plan to become a count, but simply wanted to idly spend his days in psychedelia. The balance between work and rest turned out to be better than the protagonist expected, and so it was decided to take full advantage of the noble privileges. The knight handed his master a new letter from Jutia. Entering Alan's office, he asked if anything was known about Leo's killers, but for now he needed to give the Information Guild time to investigate. Evan asked the owner what his goal was now, but it was not about revenge. Alan shrugged, replying that he was prepared for any eventuality, but thought to himself that the slight differences from the original game were most likely caused by his actions. Evan chuckled, noticing that the young gentleman was now speaking like a real count. The protagonist hurried to open the envelope. He was interested in what Utia was writing about this time. He imagined the girl happily talking about Deus, who was busy with puppet shows. Also about Solran, who loves to play with her friends. Rin is reading, and Radan is deep in gardening. Alan had made a habit of exchanging monthly news with Utia, and each time it warmed his soul more and more. Alan suddenly asked Evan how old the 5 children were now. The man replied that they were already ready to go out into the world. Those whom the Count had ordered to be saved were now about the same age. Alan, who had completely lost track of time, shuddered, and the picture of the little children began to ripple. Now his imagination pictured grown-up boys and girls who thanked him for their upbringing. Alan mumbled something in response, deciding that it was indeed time to let the students go. Evan asked if Alan had brought them together because of emotional wounds, but according to the gentleman, there was no need for that now. They had grown up, and for the sake of their future, it was time to let the boys go. Still, the protagonist took enough care of them to prevent them from awakening as the deadly sins, so everything should be fine. The knight nodded his head in agreement, making sure that the children were indeed okay. Each boss battle had an overall plan revealed through the narrative, such as Utia having a talent for faith. Deus was an unrivaled warrior and mastered the sword, while Rinna had a talent for science and loved learning how to use knowledge in practice. Solran had a talent as a fighter. She had no equal in hand-to-hand combat. And Raiden was special. He had the talent of an apostle. Alan decided that applying their talents in the right areas would give the boys a bright future. The guy twirled the pen in his hands and thought about what gifts to prepare for them. After a while, when Evan had already dozed off, Alan got up from the table with a victorious cry, shouting that everything was ready. The knight waved his hand and left the office, and the protagonist suddenly wondered whether he would get anything good in return from the boys when they grew up. And let the children go, like birds, into the big world. Utia gathered everyone together, announcing that orders had been received. This time he left them to each one separately, and each sin began to read its letter. Solran began to dance, while Deus continued to seriously read the note. Renee allowed herself a small smile. Radan's face was expressionless. Utia also looked extremely serious the whole time. But in general, Solran really wanted to make friends with everyone, and even wanted to give Rena a good book. Utia said that the previous letters should also be read, because his orders require special attention. Solran happily exclaimed that she would be glad to do this, because before, only Utia could read them. However, since he gave everyone an order, it means that now everything can be seen. When the other sins began to read the letter, they were stunned, because what was written looked like ordinary chatter. Utia shook her head, assuring that he had been disguising the orders as ordinary conversations from the very beginning. Where Alan wrote about the request to report every time what was happening in the shelter, the girl saw an order to create a blue moon. Deus agreed, calling it information leak prevention. He suggested visiting the gentleman in person and using the magic of communication. But Utia snapped that she hoped the others would understand, because they simply needed to follow orders. Deus raised an eyebrow, noting the cold, unwavering loyalty, and replied that he had not forgotten. Solran squealed with delight, urging everyone to read the order faster. The whole group turned serious again, reading the letter carefully. Deus was ordered to go to Caliburn, the land of knights. Solran was upset that she was assigned to the desert. Ren was ordered to be sent to Lartania, the labyrinth city, and Radana to Raksash, the city of entertainment. Utia lovingly pressed the letter to her chest. She had received the Holy Kingdom of Rosario. Deus was surprised that he was destined to become a knight, and Alan also told him not to worry because the patronage would continue. He also told them where the gifts were, so the boys had to hit the road. Utia looked at everyone carefully, not forgetting to warn them about something. Let not sins dare mention the name Blue Moon until he speaks of it first. Having put on their traveling coats, the group of young people finally left the shelter. A long road of adventure awaited them, appointed by his supreme will. 3 months passed. Alan was busy studying the literature in the game. As he expected, there was no word about magic or spells. He would have to experiment on his own. He asked Evan how the information gathering on Leo's killer was progressing, and again, the Information Guild did not provide an answer. Alan wondered if things had gone wrong again because he had saved the 5 deadly sins. Even Loria, who was supposed to die, according to the plot, became the Duchess of Altia and expands her power and influence in the criminal world. After thinking carefully, Alan asked the knight to stop the investigation. This is one of those times when ignorance is bliss. In this world, almost nothing can escape the Information Guild. If the protagonist tries to dig where he shouldn't, there can only be one result. If excessive caution leads to death, then it is pointless. After all, secret organizations do him no harm if he doesn't interfere with their affairs. Alan shrugged, adding that there was no point in continuing. Evan would ask to stop the investigation. There was another piece of news. It seems Deus recently became a knight in Caliburn. 3 months later, Evan revealed that Deus had created an entire knightly order. The protagonist assumed that the guy must be at least an expert level. Not much time has passed since his appointment. Everyone says that the world will see the 5th Swordmaster in no less than 10 years. Perhaps Deus could even become Caliburn's swordsman. Alan was very proud of him. 6 months and a year had passed since the 5 deadly sins left the orphanage, and Alan had just gotten used to the Count's work. Evan arrived to his master, informing him that Deus had become Caliburn's swordsman. Moreover, the guy became the 5th Swordmaster. Alan almost dropped the pen he was writing with, but only true professionals can become masters. A swordmaster is a superhuman who has transcended the aura of the blade. He discovers in his life a unique ability called derivation. Evan reported that Deus was about to become a swordmaster and would soon gain a unique ability. The people still gave him the title of Master. The guy had already defeated the 4th swordsman in a duel. Caliburn lost its swordmaster to the northern barbarians, with whom the city has been at war for over 10 years. Mastering and controlling mana takes 15 years, while acquiring a unique ability takes at least several decades. The first swordsman, Reinhardt, became the youngest master at 32 years old. The boy has been wielding a sword since he was 5 years old, and in the game, he was accepted as a temporary comrade and will be excluded after the end of the episode. And how did Deus, who didn't know how to use a sword, become a master? While it took Reinhardt more than 20 years. If Deus is only waiting for the acquisition of derivation, then it means that he will soon surpass Reinhardt, and it will be possible to use his skills. Alan suddenly began to doubt that maybe this wouldn't work. Evan expressed hope that the Count would not rely solely on this, but the protagonist shrugged, since only Utia wrote the letters. Even after leaving for the Holy Kingdom, she regularly sends news about the deadly sins. With whom she grew up, it seems they keep in touch. But Alan was a little offended that they did not thank him for the gifts. He patted his cheeks sharply, urging them to get back to basics and be grateful that the boys hadn't destroyed the kingdom after they woke up. The protagonist looked out the window and concluded that he was happy as long as the orphanage's pupils were doing well. The lights of the city of Caliburna looked incredibly beautiful, especially in the central area of Kirtam, the residence of a high-ranking nobleman. The famous Knights of the Solar Eclipse also lived there in a huge mansion. In the beautiful interiors on the top floor, Deus stood in armor, looking out the stained glass window. The boy became the captain of the Solar Eclipse, the youngest swordmaster. Two figures flashed in the window. The girl noticed Deus and gasped. The girl, who looked very much like Deus, smiled as she greeted her brother. He returned the smile and waved his hand at his sister, shaking his hair. Suddenly, Deus's gaze darkened. He coughed into his fist. After all, a whole year had passed. But remembering this, he still felt uneasy. Once, as a little boy, he lost everything because of damn monsters. They separated him from his loved ones, leaving only uncontrollable rage. Until now, the scene where his beloved sister was sobbing, stretching out her hands to him, was still before his eyes. Deus screamed, rushed towards her, but could do nothing. He himself ended up in prison, beaten and hungry, and felt only hatred for the whole world. The fact that the great moon saved the boy's life was not enough to swear allegiance to her. But the warrior began to carry out orders under the banner of the blue moon, because she promised that the boy would be able to take revenge. While working for Blue Moon, Deus went through many dangerous missions and training sessions, and at the same time, he did not take care of himself at all, setting only revenge as his goal. For several years, Deus carried out missions, laying the foundation for the fight against those black creatures. And quite soon, he received his first personal order. Deus's letter was not particularly impressive, and he was directed to a hotel in southern Caliburn. The guy opened the door and froze in shock, not daring to take a step, and his heart skipped a beat. His beloved, long-lost sister stood before him, and the boy rushed towards her. In that unexpected letter, the gift from the great moon was the family that Deus thought was lost forever. He almost knocked his sister to the ground, hugging her as tightly as he could. The girl was also silent from shock. Only hot tears streamed down her cheeks. Deus did not hold back his emotions. He cried, because all the pain that had accumulated over the years had only now come to light. His little sister, whom he thought was dead, is alive. Finally, Deus asked Sally what happened to her when they were separated. The girl smiled as her brother gently wiped the tears from her cheek. A little later, they moved to the living room of the hotel room to talk over a cup of tea. When the creatures dragged Sally away, she waited a long time in the darkness for her turn. It was a terrible place, a dirty, abandoned dungeon, and now it was her turn to die on a bloody scaffold in front of an ominous figure. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a flash appeared, thanks to which the girl was able to save herself. And a couple of years later, when she was almost sold to a slave trader, Sally was also lucky. She was also saved from the hands of the pagans, not allowing her to be doomed to a cruel fate. And all thanks to a mercenary named Evan, who fearlessly fought the villains. Sally walked over to the table and opened the cabinet, revealing a letter from Alan, explaining that the sponsor had sent her rare medicines. The girl looked at the note with gratitude, saying that she was very grateful to him for everything. Deus was surprised that it was he who protected his sister, and how the great moon even knew about this. The guy didn't tell anyone about his family, and Utia only knew that Deus had a connection with the black goat. I completely inappropriately recalled the crazy look of Utia, who pointed at the moon and said that he knows everything. The puzzle came together, and all the questions disappeared by themselves. Deus didn't understand why Utia was so worried, but still, it was he, the warrior, who turned out to be the fool, carrying out all the assigned tasks. If you remember his words, he knew everything from the very beginning and gave a hint to the child. The boy was stunned, realizing that he had to survive alone. A tear rolled down his cheek. Sally looked at her brother with concern and called out to him. He just smiled and ruffled the girl's hair. His swordsman dared to show willfulness, but it was he who showed generosity and mercy. But Deus lived only with hatred and a thirst for revenge against the black goat. And now, the fact that his family survived is truly a priceless gift. Utia tried to explain, hoping that everyone would understand why she followed him. The girl was not a great fanatic and did not believe him blindly. Now Deus knew for sure that he simply had to repay the debt. His goal was to become the strongest swordmaster in Caliburn, and also assemble your own order of the most skilled swordsmen. When the round moon rose in the sky, a warrior came to Deus, telling the captain that the time had come. The guy left the chambers, where a squad of warriors was already waiting for him in the main hall. This expedition will be the first step for the solar eclipse. Deus reached for the scabbard, where lay an ornate sword adorned with precious stones. No matter what difficulties may arise along the way, he will wait for the day when he can express his gratitude and repay him with dignity and prove it under the moon. And so, the Knights of the Solar Eclipse set out on a campaign against the barbarians. Alan sat in the shade of the open courtyard, next to a pile of books, and enjoyed the silence. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, and the numerous bookmarks in the book began to fly away. The guy immediately jumped to his feet and began to catch the lost scraps of paper. He intended to study diligently, and now he wrote down whole sentences from books. Returning from the labyrinth, Alan concentrated on studying, but now he did not like his own handwriting at all. A few minutes later, the protagonist nodded to himself with satisfaction. The reports on the previous attacks were ready. Refraction increases the instability of the prepared spell and increases the radius of damage. The repulsion destroys the shape, affecting the transformation of the projectile. Blue color enhances adjacent magic, such as lightning magic. The diffraction line provides penetration, meaning it deals critical damage. This is how the guy managed to defeat the golems. With his own mana reserves, Alan could only cast spells once a day, so it took a long time to learn. In this world, the seals and phrases of Babylon have long been forgotten, so there is zero information. I had to research everything myself, but it was interesting. And finally, the time came to test the results of 2 months of experiments. Alan, following his own instructions, placed his hands in a certain position. Lightning immediately shot out from the fingers in different directions. First, you have to remove the focal point, then upset the balance and trigger a lightning strike. This weak, most worthless magic was called fixation. A sphere appeared in front of Alan, inside which discharges were raging. Next came compression, and the sphere decreased in size many times over. A rift appeared, and in the darkness that followed, everything began to change. The lightning bolts intertwined intricately, creating a chain. The magic begins to grow. It acquires a specific purpose for the caster. After this, Alan spread his palm in the air, creating a fleeting bloom. A bright flash of what the main character had done burst high into the sky. A whole round dance of lightning formed on the ground next to him. Looking at the shimmering images, Alan drawled that this meant that order was also important. Because when he used the rift first, nothing worked. Someone's shouts were heard behind him, distracting the main character. Looking back, he saw Kalia Zenonia and her companion. They were looking at the Lord in amazement.